that was almost but not quite like sorrow.
"That will be my pleasure," he said.
"Thanks. I'm glad I've said everything that's on my mind. I feel better than I have in a long, long time."
"Have you set a date?"
"As a matter of fact, we have. How does January 2nd sound to you?"
"Sounds good," Johnny said. "You can count on me."
"We're going to put both places on the market, I guess," Herb said. "We've got our eye on a farm in Bidford. Nice place, 20 acres, half of it woodlot. A new start."
"Yes, a new start. That's good."
"You wouldn't have any objections to us selling the home place?" Herb asked anxiously.
"A little tug," Johnny said. "That's all."
"Yeah, that's what I feel.
A little tug."
He smiled. "Somewhere around the heart, that's where mine is. What about you?"
"About the same," Johnny said.
"How's it going down there for you?"
"Good."
"Your boys getting along?"
"Amazin' well,"
Johnny said, using one of his father's pet expressions and grinning. "How long do you think you'll be there?"
"Working with Chuck? I guess I'll stick with it through the school year if they want me. Working one-on-one has been a new kind of experience. I like it, and this has been a really good job. Atypically good, I'd say."
"What are you going to do after?"
Johnny shook his head. "I don't know yet, but I know one thing."
"What's that?"
"I'm going out for a bottle of champagne. We're going to get bombed."
His father had stood up on that September evening and clapped him on the back. "Make it 2, he said. He still got the occasional letter from Sarah Hazlitt. She and Walt were expecting their second child in April. Johnny wrote back his congratulations and his good wishes for Walt's canvas. And he thought sometimes about his afternoon with Sarah, the long, slow afternoon. It wasn't a memory he allowed himself to take out too often. He was afraid that constant exposure to the sunlight of recollection might cause it to wash out and fade, like the reddish-tinted proofs they used to give you of your graduation portraits. He had gone out a few times this fall, once with the older and newly divorced sister of the girl Chuck was seeing, but nothing had developed from any of those dates. Most of his spare time, that fall, he had spent in the company of Gregory Amos Stilson. He had become a Stilson-phile. He kept 3 loose-leaf notebooks in his bureau under his socks and underwear and T-shirts. They were filled with notes, speculations, and Xerox copies of news items. Doing this had made him uneasy. At night, as he wrote around the pasted-up clippings with a fine-line pilot pen, he sometimes felt like Arthur Bremer or the Moore woman who had tried to shoot Jerry Ford. He knew that if Edgar Langt, fearless minion of the FBI, could see him doing this, his phone, living room, and bathroom would be tapped in a jiffy. There would be an Acme furniture van parked across the street, only instead of being full of furniture, it would be loaded with cameras and mics and God knew what else. He kept telling himself that he wasn't Bremer, that Stilson wasn't an obsession, but that got harder to believe after the long afternoons at the UNH library, searching through old newspapers and magazines and feeding dimes into the photocopier. It got harder to believe on the nights he burned the midnight oil, writing out his thoughts and trying to make valid connections. It grew well-nigh impossible to believe on those graveyard-ditch 3 a.m.s when he woke up sweating from the recurring nightmare. The nightmare was nearly always the same, a naked replay of his handshake with Stilson at the Trimble rally. The sudden blackness, the feeling of being in a tunnel filled with the glare of the onrushing headlight, a headlight bolted to some black engine of doom. The old man with the humble, frightened eyes administering an unthinkable oath of office. The nuances of feeling coming and going like tight puffs of smoke. And a series of brief images, strung together in a flapping row like the plastic pennants over a used car dealer's lot. His mind whispered to him that these images were all related, that they told a picture story of a titanic approaching doom, perhaps even the Armageddon of which Vera Smith had been so endlessly confident. But what were the images? What were they exactly? They were hazy, impossible to see except in vague outline, because there was always that puzzling blue filter between, the blue filter that was sometimes cut by those yellow markings like tiger stripes. The only clear image in these dream replays came near the end. the screams of the dying, the smell of the dead. And a single tiger padding through miles of twisted metal, fused glass, and scorched earth. The tiger was always laughing, and it seemed to be carrying something in its mouth, something blue and yellow and dripping blood. There had been times in the fall when he thought that dream would send him mad. Ridiculous dream. The possibility it seemed to point to was impossible, after all. Best to drive it totally out of his mind. But because he couldn't, he researched Gregory Stilson and tried to tell himself it was only a harmless hobby and not a dangerous obsession. Stilson had been born in Tulsa. His father had been an oil-field roughneck who drifted from job to job, working more often than some of his colleagues because of his tremendous size. His mother might once have been pretty, although there was only a hint of that in the 2 pictures that Johnny had been able to unearth. If she had been, the times and the man she had been married to had dimmed her prettiness quickly. The pictures showed little more than another Dust Bowl face, a Southeast United States Depression woman who was wearing a faded print dress and holding a baby, Greg, in her scrawny arms and squinting into the sun. His father had been a domineering man who didn't think much of his son. As a child, Greg had been pallid and sickly. There was no evidence that his father had abused the boy either mentally or physically, but there was the suggestion that at the very least, Greg Stilson had lived in a disapproving shadow for the first 9 years of his life. The one picture Johnny had of the father and son together was a happy one, however. It showed them together in the oil fields, the father's arms slung around the son's neck in a careless gesture of comradeship. But it gave Johnny a little chill all the same. Harry Stilson was dressed in working clothes, twill pants and a double-breasted khaki shirt, and his hard hat was cocked jauntily back on his head. Greg had begun school in Tulsa, then had been switched to Oklahoma City when he was 10. The previous summer his father had been killed in an oil derrick flameout. Mary Lou Stilson had gone to Okie City with her boy because it was where her mother lived and where the war work was. It was 1942, and good times had come around again. Greg's grades had been good until high school, and then he began to get into a series of scrapes. Truancy, fighting, hustling snooker downtown, maybe hustling stolen goods uptown, although that had never been proved. In 1949, when he had been a high school junior, he had pulled a 2-day suspension for putting a cherry bomb firecracker in a locker room toilet. In all of these confrontations with authority, Mary Lou Stilson took her son's part. The good times, at least for the likes of the Stilsons, had ended with the war work in 1945, and Mrs. Stilson seemed to think of it as a case of her and her boy against the rest of the world. Her mother had died, leaving her the small frame house and nothing else. She hustled drinks in a roughneck bar for a while, then waited table in an all-night beanery. And when her boy got in trouble, she went to bat for him, never checking, apparently, to see if his hands were dirty or clean. The pale, sickly boy that his father had nicknamed Runt was gone by 1949. As Greg Stilson's adolescence progressed, his father's physical legacy came out. The boy shot up 6 inches and put on 70 pounds between 13 and 17. He did not play organized school sports, but somehow managed to acquire a Charles Atlas bodybuilding gym and then a set of weights. The Runt became a bad guy to mess with. Johnny guessed he must have come close to dropping out of school on dozens of occasions. He had probably avoided a bust out of sheer dumb luck. If only he had taken at least one serious bust, Johnny thought often. It would have ended all these stupid worries, because a convicted felon can't aspire to high public office. Stilson had graduated, near the bottom of his class, it was true, in June 1951. Grades notwithstanding, there was nothing wrong with his brains. His eye was on the main chance. He had a glib tongue and a winning manner. He worked briefly that summer as a gas jockey. Then, in August of that year, Greg Stilson had gotten Jesus at a tent revival in Wildwood Green. He quit his job at the 76 station and went into business as a rainmaker through the power of Jesus Christ our Lord. Coincidentally or otherwise, that had been one of the driest summers in Oklahoma since the days of the Dust Bowl. The crops were already a dead loss. and the livestock would soon follow if the shallowing wells went dry. Greg had been invited to a meeting of the local Ranchers Association. Johnny had found a great many stories about what had followed. It was one of the high points of Stilson's career. None of the stories completely jibed, and Johnny could understand why. It had all the attributes of an American myth, not much different from some of the stories about Davy Crockett, Pecos Bill, Paul Bunyan. That something had happened was undeniable, but the strict truth of it was already beyond reach. One thing seemed sure. That meeting of the Ranchers Association must have been one of the strangest ever held. The ranchers had invited over 24 rainmakers from various parts of the southeast and southwest. About half of them were Negroes. 2 were Indians, a half-breed Pawnee and a full-blooded Apache. There was a peyote-chewing Mexican. Greg was one of about 9 white fellows, and the only hometown boy. The ranchers heard the proposals of the rainmakers and dowsers one by one. They gradually and naturally divided themselves into 2 groups. Those who would take half of their fee up front, non-refundable, and those who wanted their entire fee up front, non-refundable. When Greg Stilson's turn came, he stood up, hooked his thumbs into the belt loops of his jeans, and was supposed to have said, "I guess you fellas know I got in the way of being able to make it rain after I gave my heart to Jesus. Before that, I was deep in sin and the ways of sin. Now, one of the main ways of sin is the way we've seen tonight, and you spell that kind of sinning mostly with $signs. The ranchers were interested. Even at 19, Stilson had been something of a comic spellbinder, and he had made them an offer they couldn't refuse. Because he was a born-again Christian, and because he knew that the love of money was the root of all evil, he would make it rain, and afterward they could pay him whatever they thought the job had been worth. He was hired by acclamation, and 2 days later he was down on his knees in the back of a flatbed farm truck, cruising slowly along the highways and byways of central Oklahoma, dressed in a black coat and a preacher's low-crowned hat, praying for rain through a pair of loudspeakers hooked up to a Delco tractor battery. People turned out by the thousands to get a look at him. The end of the story was predictable but satisfying. The skies grew cloudy during the afternoon of Greg's second day on the job, and the next morning the rains came. The rains came for 3 days and 2 nights. Flash floods killed 4 people. Whole houses with chickens perched on the roof peaks were washed down the Greenwood River. The wells were filled. The livestock was saved. And the Oklahoma Ranchers and Cattlemen's Association decided it probably would have happened anyway. They passed the hat for Greg at their next meeting, and the young rainmaker was given the princely sum of $17. Greg was not put out of countenance. He used the $17 to place an ad in the Oklahoma City Herald. The ad pointed out that about the same sort of thing had happened to a certain rat catcher in the town of Hamlin. Being a Christian, the ad went on, Greg Stilson was not in the way of taking children, and he surely knew he had no legal recourse against a group as large and powerful as the Oklahoma Ranchers and Cattlemen's Association. But fair was fair, wasn't it? He had his elderly mother to support, and she was in failing health. The ad suggested that he had prayed his ass off for a bunch of rich, ungrateful snobs, the same sort of men that had tractored poor folks like the Jodes off their land in the 30s. The ad suggested that he had saved tens of thousands of dollars worth of livestock and had got $17 in return. Because he was a good Christian, this sort of ingratitude didn't bother him. But maybe it ought to give the good citizens of the county some pause. Right-thinking people could send contributions to Box 471, care of the Herald. Johnny wondered how much Greg Stilson had actually received as a result of that ad. Reports varied, but that fall Greg had been tooling around town in a brand-new Mercury. 3 years' worth of back taxes were paid on the small house left to them by Mary Lou's mother. Mary Lou herself, who was not particularly sickly and no older than 45, blossomed out in a new raccoon coat. Stilson had apparently discovered one of the great hidden muscles of principle which move the earth. If those who receive will not pay, those who have not often will, for no good reason at all. It may be the same principle that assures the politicians there will always be enough young men to feed the war machine. The ranchers discovered they had stuck their collective hand into a hornet's nest. When members came into town, crowds often gathered and jeered at them. They were denounced from pulpits all across the county. They found it suddenly difficult to sell the beef the rain had saved without shipping it a considerable distance. In November of that memorable year, 2 young men with brass knucks on their hands and nickel-plated .32s in their pockets had turned up on Greg Stilson's doorstep, apparently hired by the Ranchers and Cattlemen's Association to suggest, as strenuously as necessary, that Greg would find the climate more congenial elsewhere. Both of them ended up in the hospital. One of them had a concussion. The other had lost 4 of his teeth and was suffering a rupture. Both had been found on the corner of Greg Stilson's block, Saint's pants. Their brass knucks had been inserted in an anatomical location most commonly associated with sitting down, and in the case of one of these 2 young men, minor surgery was necessary to remove the foreign objects. The association cried off. At a meeting in early December, an appropriation of $700 was made from its general fund, and a check in that amount was forwarded to Greg Stilson. He got what he wanted. In 1953, he and his mother moved to Nebraska. The rain-making business had gone bad, and there were some who said the pool hall hustling had also gone bad. Whatever the reason for moving, they turned up in Omaha, where Greg opened a house-painting business that went bust 2 years later. He did better as a salesman for the Truthway Bible Company of America. He crisscrossed the Corn Belt, taking dinner with hundreds of hard-working, God-fearing farm families, telling the story of his conversion, and selling Bibles, plaques, luminous plastic Jesuses, hymn books, records, tracts, and a rabidly right-wing paperback called America the Truthway, the Communist Jewish Conspiracy Against Our United States. In 1957, the aging Mercury was replaced with a brand-new Ford ranch wagon. In 1958, Mary Lou Stilson died of cancer, and late that year Greg Stilson got out of the born-again Bible business and drifted east. He spent a year in New York City before moving upstate to Albany. His year in New York had been devoted to an effort at cracking the acting business. It was one of the few jobs, along with house painting, that he hadn't been able to turn a buck at. But probably not from lack of talent, Johnny thought cynically. In Albany, he'd gone to work for Prudential, and he stayed in the capital city until 1965. As an insurance salesman, he was an aimless sort of success. There was no offer to join the company at the executive level, no outbursts of Christian fervor. During that 5-year period, the brash and brassy Greg Stilson of yore seemed to have gone into hibernation. In all of his checkered career, the only woman in his life had been his mother. He had never married, had not even dated regularly as far as Johnny had been able to find out. In 1965, Prudential had offered him a position in Ridgway, New Hampshire, and Greg had taken it. At about the same time, his period of hibernation seemed to end. The go-go 60s were gathering steam. It was the era of the short skirt and do-your-own thing. Greg became active in Ridgway community affairs. He joined the Chamber of Commerce and the Rotary Club. He got statewide coverage in 1967 during a controversy over the parking meters downtown. For 6 years, various factions had been wrangling over them. Greg suggested that all the meters be taken out and that collection boxes be put up in their stead. Let people pay what they want. Some people had said that was the craziest idea they had ever heard. Well, Greg responded, you might just be surprised. Yes, sir, he was persuasive. The town finally adopted the proposal on a provisional basis, and the ensuing flood of nickels and dimes had surprised everyone but Greg. He had discovered the principle years ago. In 1969, he made New Hampshire news again when he suggested, in a long and carefully worked-out letter to the Ridgway newspaper, that drug offenders be put to work on town public works projects, such as parks and bike paths, even weeding the grass on the traffic islands. That's the craziest idea I ever heard, many said. Well, Greg responded, try her out, and if she don't work, chuck her. The town tried it out. One pothead reorganized the entire town library from the outmoded Dewey Decimal System to the more modern Library of Congress cataloging system, at no charge to the town. A number of hippies busted at an hallucinogenic house party re-landscaped the town park into an area showplace, complete with duck pond and a playground scientifically designed to maximize effective playtime and minimize danger. As Greg pointed out, most of these drug users got interested in all those chemicals in college. But that was no reason why they shouldn't utilize all the other things they had learned in college. At the same time Greg was revolutionizing his adopted hometown's parking regulations and its handling of drug offenders, he was writing letters to the Manchester Union Leader, the Boston Globe, and the New York Times, espousing hawkish positions on the war in Vietnam, mandatory felony sentences for heroin addicts, and a return to the death penalty, especially for heroin pushers. In his campaign for the House of Representatives, he had claimed on several occasions to have been against the war from 1970 on, but the man's own published statements made that a flat lie. In 1970, Greg Stilson had opened his own insurance and realty company. He was a great success. In 1973, he and 3 other businessmen had financed and built a shopping mall on the outskirts of Capital City, the county seat of the district he now represented. That was the year of the Arabian oil boycott, also the year Greg started driving a Lincoln Continental. It was also the year he ran for mayor of Ridgeway. The mayor enjoyed a 2-year term, and 2 years before, in 1971, he had been asked by both the Republicans and Democrats of the largish, population 8,500, New England town to run. He had declined both of them with smiling thanks. In 73 he ran as an independent, taking on a fairly popular Republican who was vulnerable because of his fervent support of President Nixon, and a Democratic figurehead. He donned his construction helmet for the first time. His campaign slogan was, "Let's build a better Ridgeway." He won in a landslide. A year later, in New Hampshire's sister state of Maine, the voters turned away from both the Democrat, George Mitchell, and the Republican, James Irwin, and elected an insurance man from Lewiston named James Longley, their governor. The lesson had not been lost on Gregory Amos Stilson. Around the Xerox clippings were Johnny's notes and the questions he regularly asked himself. He had been over his chain of reasoning so often that now, as Chancellor and Brinkley continued to chronicle the election results, he could have spouted the whole thing word for word. First, Greg Stilson shouldn't have been able to get elected. His campaign promises were, by and large, jokes. His background was all wrong. His education was all wrong. It stopped at the 12th grade level, and, until 1965, he had been little more than a drifter. In a country where the voters have decided that the lawyers should make the laws, Stilson's only brushes with that force had been from the wrong side. He wasn't married, and his personal history was decidedly freaky. Second, the press had left him almost completely and very puzzlingly alone. In an election year when Wilbur Mills had admitted to a mistress, when Wayne Hayes had been dislodged from his barnacle-encrusted house seat because of his, when even those in the houses of the mighty had not been immune from the rough-and-ready frisking of the press, the reporters should have had a field day with Stilson. His colorful, controversial personality seemed to stir only amused admiration from the national press, and he seemed to make no one, except maybe Johnny Smith, nervous. His bodyguards had been Harley-Davidson beach boppers only a few years ago, and people had a way of getting hurt at Stilson rallies. But no investigative reporter had done an in-depth study of that. At a campaign rally in Capital City, at that same mall Stilson had had a hand in developing, an 8-year-old girl had suffered a broken arm and a dislocated neck. Her mother swore hysterically that one of those motorcycle maniacs had pushed her from the stage when the girl tried to climb up